Good morning. It's a joy to be with you today to once again talk about redemption. We usually think of redemption as something that impacts our final destiny, a place we go, after we die, what God does to change that. But today, I want to talk about the nitty-gritty of redemption. The way that God enters into your story and into mine to transform us and to transform this life into something beautiful. Because God is a master at redeeming our pain for his glory. Make sure it doesn't want to go. Oh, there we go. It woke up. Let's face it, Mother's Day is not everybody's favorite day of the year. Now, when I say that, I'm not primarily thinking of those of you who are not good at gift giving. And so every year it becomes a scramble at the last minute to think of something to give mom, and you rush out at the last minute and all the good bouquets are gone, or you can't remember which kind of chocolate she likes. I'm also not thinking of those of you who, because of not planning ahead, resort to sending an e-card every year and then feel bad about it. Mother's Day is often difficult for deeper reasons. I'm thinking of men and women who've lost their mother, maybe recently, or whose mother never really understood them. Maybe you're one of those who goes to stand in the Hallmark section and you read every single card and leave empty-handed because you just can't bring yourself to send mom a card that isn't true. I'm also thinking of those who want to be mothers and don't have that opportunity, for the woman who's waited and waited and waited for the right man to come along and marry her. And so she can't be a mom. Or for the couple who's been waiting and waiting for God to grant them a child to hold, and it's just not happening. I think, too, of the men among us who feel responsible for their wife's empty arms. Mother's Day is hard for moms for lots of reasons. Some moms feel like they're not worth being celebrated. Maybe they don't feel like they've been a very good mom. Maybe they've watched their children walk away from the Lord or just go through a period of rebellion. Or perhaps you've lost a child, and so today just brings back that grief again. For all of these, Mother's Day is tough. I'll never forget Mother's Day in the year 2000. But to tell you that story, we have to turn back the clock to the fall of 1999. Danny and I had been married for just over a year, and though we hadn't been planning it, I found myself pregnant. I could tell you that story later. We were elated and told every living soul our happy news. Family, friends, neighbors, co-workers, the mailman, the checker at Fred Meyer. There wasn't anybody who didn't get to hear about it. And it's not liking this again. There we go. See how happy I am? But then something happened that we'll never understand. For some inexplicable reason, the little life inside me stopped growing. The little heart stopped beating. Our baby was dead. And it was right before Christmas, which made Christmas really hard. But that next, first I should say the months following our loss were difficult because though we had broadcast our happy news, we couldn't quite bring ourselves to broadcast the sorrow. And so for months, I had people coming up to me, "How are you feeling? When are you due? Is it a boy or a girl? Have you found out yet?" And I would have to break the news to them, so it prolonged the sorrow. That Mother's Day was especially difficult. Our church hosted a Mother's Day tea, and my mom was there, my mother-in-law, and my grandmother, and there we sit. And I looked sort of happy in the picture, but I have to say it was a tough day. I would have been 7 months pregnant by then, but I had nothing to show for it. The MC had prepared prizes for the oldest mom, the mom who had traveled the farthest, the mom who had the most kids, the youngest mom. I hardly knew what to do with myself. Was I the youngest mom in the room, or wasn't I? I had been a mom, sort of. I felt like a mom, but I didn't have half the stories to share that moms should be able to share. Not only had I lost my child, but my own identity was uncertain. My status was ambiguous. It was a very awkward time. Mother's Day is one of those days that can pour salt on the wound of a broken heart. And so today we ask, what does redemption mean for the brokenhearted? What does God do for those of us with empty arms or empty lives? And what we'll discover is that God is a master at redeeming our pain for his glory. So I'd like to look together at the book of Ruth, one of the greatest stories ever told, not just in the Bible, but in all of literature. It's masterfully written. It's near the beginning of your Bible, just after the book of Judges, and if you're using the Bible from under the seat in front of you, it's page 258. No extra charge for that. You can read the whole thing in about 20 minutes, which I encourage you to do this afternoon. It's a great story. Some of you have been studying Ruth in your growth groups, so you've been thinking a lot about Ruth, and maybe you've discovered that if we want to understand the book of Ruth, we've got to pay attention, really close attention, to the first and last verses of the book. It's easy to miss them, but they're crucial in setting the stage. And so we're going to start with Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. Fairly straightforward, but we need to know that the backdrop of the story of the book of Ruth is the bleakest time in Israel's history. In the days when the judges ruled was nothing short of anarchy. Some of the most shocking stories in the Bible take place in the book of Ruth. And I'm only showing you one picture because I couldn't find any more that were fit to be seen. Rampant idolatry, callousness, murder, gang rape, dismemberment. It is a series of horrific tales, and these are stories that are not happening in someone else's backyard. Some of these horrific stories begin right in Bethlehem, which is a city we associate with a very different event. And so when the author of Judges tells us that the story takes place in the days when the judges ruled, we ought to wince and brace ourselves because this could get ugly. And indeed, things start out quite upside down. There's a famine in the land, the promised land, the land of milk and honey. That's not how things are supposed to work. And so a man from Bethlehem in Judea takes his wife and his 2 sons, and they travel to live. It doesn't like me. There we go. They travel to live in the land of Moab. Now, Moab might not mean much to you, but this is the equivalent of saying something like, there was a famine in the Midwestern United States, and so a farmer took his wife and 2 sons and moved from Sioux Center, Iowa to Cuba. This is about the equivalent. Moab was no friend to Israel. The two had had an uneasy coexistence for centuries. In fact, on their way into the Promised Land, Israel had camped out for a while in Moab, and the Moabites were not happy about this. The Israelites used it as a base for raids north into the Ammonite territory, which they were authorized to go and raid. And the Moabites didn't want to be party to this, and so they tried to call down curses on the Israelites. And when that didn't work, they tried another method and enticed the Israelite men to come and indulge in sexual immorality with their women, which worked. And then the women enticed them to worship idols. So the result was not pretty. In fact, God issued a command after this time saying that Israelites were to have nothing to do with Moabites. As an aside, that sounds a little bit weird to us now because we live in the age of bringing the gospel to all nations, right? And we're supposed to engage with people of other cultures. But this is a different time in Israel's history when God is up to something different, and he's preparing his people to be a light to all nations. And in order to prepare them, he needs to put them in a place of their own so they can grow up and learn how to live as his people. And for that to work, they need to not be engaging with pagan nations like the Moabites. And so when the curtain opens on the story of Ruth, and we have a man from Bethlehem going to live in Moab, we ought to be groaning. This is not good news. To make things worse, in Hebrew, the name Bethlehem means house of bread. It's like sticking in the knife and turning it. Right there in the breadbasket of the land of promise, famine rages. A famine so severe that an Israelite man and his family have to cross enemy lines just to survive. This is not the way things are supposed to work out in the land God promised to his people. They live in Moab long enough, this is where the story gets worse, for Naomi's husband to die and for her 2 sons to marry Moabite women. And then, before they have produced any grandchildren, Naomi's sons die too. So now Naomi has nothing left but 2 Moabite daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. If you're reading too fast, you think it's Ruth and Oprah, but it's not Oprah, it's Orpah. Naomi has no man to provide protection for her, no grandchildren to care for her as she grows older. There's no Medicare, no Medicaid, no food stamps, no food bank, and no paying jobs for respectable women. Around that time when things couldn't get any worse, Naomi hears that God has redeemed his people, visited them by providing food again in Bethlehem. And so Naomi heads home to Bethlehem. And remarkably, you know the story, one of her Moabite daughters-in-law decides to go along with her. Now, have you ever stopped to ask yourself, if your own mother-in-law had lost everything and was going to move back home to another country, would you go with her to live out your days? This is really remarkable. When they arrive, Naomi tells the women of Bethlehem, this is chapter 1, verse 20, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. The name no longer fits. "Call me Mara," which means bitter, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. I love that this is in the Bible, by the way, these kinds of expressions, because sometimes you and I feel like that. I suspect that if Mother's Day had been celebrated in ancient Israel, Naomi would have planned to be absent that day. Like maybe some of our own are absent today. She had almost nothing to show for her 10 years outside the land other than broken dreams. So now we fast forward to the last verse of the book, chapter 4, verse 17, the last verse of the story. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. In this one verse, we see not only the resolution to Naomi's personal problems, but the resolution to the problems of the Israelite nation as a whole. Remember, the book tells us that this story happens in the days when the judges ruled. Well, if you read the book of Judges, which is the book that chronicles this dark time in Israel's history, you start to hear a refrain over and over again. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. To say that over and over again, like the author of Judges does, implies that what we really need is a king who could come in and bring order to this chaos and remind us how to do what's right in God's eyes. Well, here we are told that Naomi's great-grandson is none other than King David. God is a master at redeeming our pain for his glory. Naomi's life is exhibit A in this truth. In her situation, God took a childless widow, empty and bitter, having given up on God's promises, and made her the great-grandmother of Israel's greatest king. He's not content just to resolve her personal problems. He does so in such a way that the entire nation benefits and God is glorified. So, what happened in the middle of the story? We've seen the first and last verses, but what happened in the middle to make this possible? Where did this Obed come from? You're probably familiar with the story. When they arrive in Bethlehem, Ruth, who's the Moabite daughter-in-law, goes to a nearby field to collect grain left behind by the harvesters. This was sort of like the cultural built-in way of surviving on food stamps. You just pick up the stuff that's left behind. She's really diligent about her work, and it does not go unnoticed. Boaz, the older man who owns the field, hears about Ruth and about what she's doing for her mother-in-law, and he talks to his workers and says, make sure that no harm comes to her while she's working in my fields. Ruth, being an unmarried woman in the days when the judges ruled, is in a very vulnerable position. This would be like hanging out in the middle of the night, in the bad part of town. This is not a safe place for her. But Boaz makes sure that she is safe. He's both generous and kind to her. And as God would have it, as fate would have it, as it turns out, Boaz is a relative of the family. He is a relative of Naomi's deceased husband, and he's such a close relative that he's given a special title, Goel. Everybody say that with me. Goel. It means guardian redeemer. And Goel gets expressed in several different ways in ancient Israelite culture. So here are a couple of examples. If a close relative has had to sell the family land in order to pay a debt, a Goel would step in and buy back the land so that it can stay in the family and that the inheritance isn't jeopardized. More severely, if a relative has had to sell himself or herself into slavery to pay a debt, a Goel might buy the person back so that they're free again. Even in cases where there's been a murder, a Goel will sometimes avenge the blood of a murdered relative. In this case, in the story of Ruth, Naomi asks Ruth to undertake a daring plan, to ask Boaz to exercise his duties as guardian redeemer, and it will do several things. It will provide a husband for Ruth. It will provide a caretaker for the land that belonged to Naomi, and it will provide protection and offspring for Naomi. And so Ruth shows up at the threshing floor in the middle of the night where Boaz is asleep. This is a little strange to us. Why would you be sleeping at the threshing floor? But if you've just collected all your grain and you're threshing it and you aren't finished yet, you wouldn't just leave it there overnight for somebody to come along and grab it and go. And so Boaz is spending the night at the threshing floor, and Ruth shows up and uncovers his feet and waits for him to wake up. When he does, she asks him to redeem her family from their precarious situation. She says cleverly, "Spread the corner of your garment over me." Now, commentaries have had a lot of fun with this one. She is not asking him for sex. She is asking him to redeem her family, to take that role of protector, to assume that responsibility. And Boaz generously agrees, though he has nothing to gain from this. As soon as things are legalized, God gives them a son, Obed, to restore Naomi's family line. So here's what I want you to notice about this story of redemption on today, Mother's Day. God uses ordinary people and works through ordinary means to accomplish redemption in the here and now. There's no white horse, no spaceship, no voice from the sky. These are just faithful people who are doing their job and who are operating within cultural conventions to provide for those who need it. If you want to read about our eternal destiny, you'll have to read somewhere else in the Bible. In the story of Ruth, the good news is that God can take an empty life and fill it with meaning again. For Naomi, Redemption comes through an unlikely alliance between a respected male relative and a young, childless Moabite widow. However, the story, again, is not just about making Naomi happy. It's about bringing redemption to an entire nation in the process. And he has worked through similar circumstances before. This is where it gets fun. I hope you're ready for a history lesson. You might have noticed when we turned to the end of the book of Ruth that I didn't read you the actual last verse of the book. So peek there again, and you'll see that the book actually ends with a longer genealogy. Genealogies do not tend to be our favorite parts of the Old Testament. We skip them for two reasons. One, they're boring, and two, the names are hard to pronounce. But if we pay close attention to this genealogy, it becomes very enlightening, helping us understand what's going on in the book of Ruth. So here's how the author starts. This then is the family line of Perez. And then we get 10 names stretching from Perez down to Boaz, Obed, Jesse, and David. Now, we've all heard of David, but who's Perez? Well, to answer that question, we flip back in our Bibles to Genesis chapter 38. I guarantee this is not a story you ever heard in Sunday school. This is one of the crazy, seedy stories of Israel's history. And today, I'm just going to go through it because it's going to show us, it's going to help us appreciate what Boaz has done. So this is the story of Judah. Judah is one of Jacob's 12 sons, so the 12 heads of the tribes of Israel. And Judah marries a Canaanite woman, which should make us raise our eyebrows given God's plan with his people to set them apart. But as it is, he marries a Canaanite woman, and God gives them 3 children, Onan, and Shelah. Follows in his father's footsteps and marries Tamar, a Canaanite woman. But is not a good boy, and the Bible tells us that his wickedness results in God striking him dead. And so is out of the picture. And now we have a childless Canaanite widow. And customarily, what happens in that situation is that the closest brother-in-law would be given to her in marriage, or she'd be given to him in marriage, and whatever child they bear would actually be the first husband's, technically speaking, in terms of inheritance. And this is how you make sure no name dies out in the families of Israel. If you did, then you'd end up with some tribes getting bigger and bigger, and some getting smaller and smaller, and things would get uneven. And so Judah gives Tamar to his second son, Onan, who's not so hot on this whole idea. And so he makes sure that none of his seed gets planted in her field, if you get my drift. This is wicked in the eyes of the Lord, and so Onan follows in the footsteps of his brother and gets struck dead. I told you this is exciting stuff. Now, naturally, the next thing that should happen is Tamar should be given to Shelah in marriage. But Shelah is not old enough yet, and so she waits and waits and waits, and finally he grows up enough and clearly she's not going to be given to him in marriage. Around that time, Judah's wife dies, and so Tamar hatches a plan. Now, this is not a plan that goes down in the good girls of the Bible list or in the go therefore and do likewise. This is a plan that raises our eyebrows. She dresses as a prostitute and positions herself along the road where she knows Judah will be walking, and somehow she is confident that he will provide her with children on that walk down that road. And sure enough, he does what she expects him to do, and she becomes pregnant. Not only pregnant, but she bears twins. The name of her twins are Perez and Zerah. So there's our Perez that we've been wondering about. So to sum it all up, Perez is the son of the patriarch Judah, who failed to provide redemption for his childless Canaanite daughter-in-law until she took matters into her own hands. Now, when Judah finds out that Tamar is pregnant, he is outraged, and he orders that she be stoned until she produces the collateral that was given to her in the dark of night, and he recognizes it as his own. And then he concludes, "She is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah. So he recognizes his own failure to provide for her as his daughter-in-law. So how does this relate to the book of Ruth? Well, Perez becomes the father of Hezron, who becomes the father of Ram, who becomes the father of Amminadab, who becomes the father of Nahshon, who becomes the father of Salmon, who, like his ancestors, marries a Canaanite woman. You've probably heard of her, Rahab. She was a prostitute in Jericho. Yes, colorful family history. But a righteous prostitute, right? She hides the spies and helps them escape so that God gives them the city. Oh, the Bible's so much fun. The fruit of their marriage is a man named Boaz. So who is Boaz? You know, Boaz is not just some random Israelite out in the fields. Boaz's mom is a Canaanite who married the great-great-great-grandson of Perez, who was the son of the patriarch Judah, who failed to provide redemption for his childless Canaanite daughter-in-law until she took matters into her own hands. So how does this relate to Ruth? Let's look at Ruth's family tree now. We have Naomi and Elimelech bear two sons, Mahlon and Chilion. Both of them marry Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then Mahlon dies, and Chilion dies, and so Ruth can't be given to him in marriage the way that she ought to be to bear children for her mother-in-law. And then Elimelech dies, and so now the closest family relative who's willing to exercise his right as Goel is Boaz. And so Boaz and Ruth come together, have a son named Obed, and this is resolving Naomi's issue with no offspring. Here's a sneak preview. Women do not normally show up in genealogies. Like, I've added the women in here so that you know who's who just based on stories in the Bible. But when you get to the book of Matthew and you read Jesus' genealogy, guess who shows up? Rahab, Ruth, and Tamar. 3 of the 4 women mentioned in the genealogy come from this story, which tells me that in the grand scheme of redemption, God uses unlikely people, and he doesn't want us to forget about it. Do you see how he used the messiest parts of Boaz's own story to uniquely prepare him to act courageously on Naomi's behalf, on Ruth's behalf? This is not the story that you and I would have written. And these are not the people that you and I would have chosen to be part of the Messiah's family tree. But here we are. God is a master at redeeming our pain for his glory, our messy family trees even. The redemption that is brought to us in Jesus is not otherworldly. It redeems the messes of this life and makes them into something beautiful. Things like divorce, miscarriage, conflict, mental illness, loss, broken promises, unresolved conflict. When Danny and I lost our first child, it changed us, as grief does. It hollowed out a place in us where we could experience empathy for others who were going through hard times. It also made us extra grateful when God went on to bless us with 3 beautiful children. You met Anna before I got up here to speak. Is there any question that God has redeemed our pain for his glory? She's a hard act to follow. So this Mother's Day is a happy one for me. I have a mom who loves me and she's good at showing it to me. I have no trouble finding a Mother's Day card because she's all those things. I have a mother-in-law who's fun to be with and full of thoughtfulness. She's home watching our youngest who has a fever this morning. She was in the first service. Many of you share this joy. Mother's Day is a happy day for you. But for others of you, Mother's Day intensifies the feelings of loss and heartache that you carry in your hearts. Whether they're from long ago or today, I want you to know that the same God who worked in the pages of Scripture to bring redemption to broken hearts is still at work today. Amen. He's a master at redeeming our pain for his glory. My girls brought me to see Cinderella last week as an early Mother's Day present. Has anybody seen it? Few hands, the rest of you need to go see it. It's amazing. I thought I knew the story of Cinderella, but it just made it captivating. Cinderella endures the mistreatment of her stepmother and her stepsisters with such grace. She continues to serve them generously. She chooses to have courage and to be kind in the face of the pain that she feels. And the delight, it's amazing to see the delight she takes in everyday tasks when she could be bitter. One day, she's on a ride out in the woods and she meets the prince, although she doesn't know it's him. And he is rather amused that she doesn't know who he is. And so they have a really fun conversation. But he comes away captivated by Cinderella's character, by her innocence and purity, by the strength of forgiveness that she shows. It's really beautiful. His father is busy lobbying for him to marry for advantage. Their kingdom is small and needs, alliances with other great kingdoms. But the prince is convinced that what his kingdom really needs is Cinderella, someone with strength of character to lead. And I wager that the entire nation reaped the benefits of his choice to marry for character rather than marrying someone with wealth and power to spare. In the scene where Cinderella finds the prince finds Cinderella and tries on the glass slipper, before she puts it on, she says, she's just wearing her plain, raggedy clothes, says to him, "Will you take me as I am? A poor girl without any pretense. I have nothing to offer you but myself." And of course he says yes, gladly. Boaz had nothing to gain by marrying Ruth, and the prince had nothing to gain by marrying Cinderella, but they both knew noble character when they saw it. It's fitting, I think, that this is Compassion Sunday. We didn't plan it that way back, but that's how it worked out. You've been introduced to children around the world who are stuck in a cycle of poverty and for whom hunger and heartache are a daily reality. Could you be their Goel, the one who steps in to redeem them from this cycle they can't break free themselves? It's true that God is a master at redeeming our pain for his glory. But as with Ruth, he uses ordinary people to accomplish this redemption. God is glorified when we participate in his work of redemption. Redemption is not a thing where we sit back and watch him do what he does. Redemption is something where we put on our work gloves and our work boots and we partner with him. God is on the lookout for men and women of noble character, like Ruth, who will bring our brokenness and lay it at his feet, asking him to redeem the mess that we are in. He's also on the lookout for men and women of noble character, like Boaz, who will be determined, take bold steps to make sure that no one goes hungry on their watch, and that no one goes unnoticed, that they are in a position to redeem. Through the participation of ordinary people like us, God is working out redemption and bringing it to those who need it most. And he gets all the glory.